I'd just like to just tell you the rundown for the afternoon. We'll probably have our panel discussion run until about 5 o'clock, and then from 5 to 5:20 we can do an open Q&A where everyone can just ask questions. Again, kind of the great thing about this event is you can run some of the policy work that you guys are working on now by our panelists to just get some feedback or some suggestions on what are some good areas to explore going forward for the journal. So and then maybe from 5:20 to 5:30 you can even come up and introduce yourselves to the speakers and just ask some questions, get to know them. So I guess just to start off, Professor Cohen, I wonder if you.
I'm sitting in the middle. I'm not supposed to go first.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Professor Cohen. I'm wondering if you could just first perhaps explain, the economic crisis and the fallout from it, and perhaps what it means for the city and state, and kind of the challenges, the main challenges that are being faced here, and just explaining the circumstances.
What I can do is to give you my impression as a political scientist. I'm not an economist, but I'm a political scientist who's worried a lot about public finance and how you take the resources out of the city to keep the city that we all love growing and prospering. And that's particularly difficult for New York because as beautiful as New York is and as prosperous as it has looked to all of us for the last, let's say, 10 years, that it has been based on an economy that is drawing on the tremendous value of real estate in the city of New York and the stock exchange and the economic optimism that feeds the stock exchange and Wall Street. At the same time, and people who have lived here longer, I think, can comment on this better than I, we've seen a constriction of other areas of our economy in the city. So manufacturing, pretty much gone. Retail has gone to the chain stores, to the big stores, to the upper end retailing, drawing on tourists, drawing on people who get bonuses. But in a way, it has led to the restriction and not the disappearance, but certainly, let's just say the oppression of the middle class and the working class in the city of New York. Housing, as you all know, is very, very expensive. New York City today has the biggest gap of any of the major cities in the United States between rich and poor. And the same thing is true for the state of New York. 8.7 to 1 difference between the top 20% and the bottom 20%. That is the biggest in the country. And what that tells you is that for the city of New York to maintain its way of life and to continue to draw on those who are not as well off to work in industries like retail and hospitality and all the other things that we depend on, we've got to have affordable housing. We've got to have good education. So New York is a city that depends on what we call, and you've heard John McCain accuse Barack Obama of this, and goodness, I hope Barack Obama really does do this, the redistribution of resources. Taxing, through taxes, bringing in resources that will build affordable housing, that will strengthen the community, that will build good education, that will build a transit system. So that, I think, is sort of the situation where we are. What has happened is that when the top part of that economic bubble began to constrict, we all began to look around and say, wait a minute, where are the taxes going to come from to do all these things that we depend on government to do in the city of New York? And frankly, I think we need government to do more of. So I think that's the crisis that we face, is that we have a state that hasn't actually helped us very much. The MTA finances far more of its own services than any other major transit system in the country. Same thing is true for education. So in a nutshell, if any of you want to talk about this more, I'd be happy to. But I think that's what faces us, that somehow we have to figure out how to diversify our economy, how to get the state to be better and more strategic at its use of tax dollars, and we have to do some heavy-duty planning in the city.
Thank you. So Senator Krueger, Professor Cohen mentioned kind of the relationship between the state and the city in dealing with this crisis, and some initiatives perhaps that could be implemented to address and alleviate some of the suffering that New Yorkers are facing in light of the downturn. I wonder if you could talk more about what's being done in Albany, and what are some things you're trying to work on in order to help mitigate this.
Well, I have to say, before I went to Albany 6.5 years ago, I think I would have said some of the same things the professor said pretty directly. And now that I've gone to Albany, I think I have a broader appreciation for the complexity of our state, the upstate versus downstate reality. So, as bad as the economic situation for the city is right now, and it is, we're the breadbasket for the rest of the state. We're the Ukraine for New York. So I'm not sure that analogy works anymore, but it works. I've had my fantasies, but no worse. So that New York City is facing a serious economic challenge, specifically because we are so heavily dependent in our tax structure on the industries that are doing the worst right now. Real estate, finance, and insurance. And even the MTA, when we talked about what do we need to do, the MTA fare hikes that we are facing, the incredible deficit in both capital and operating costs for the MTA. Do you know that their money comes out of real estate transfer taxes? So as nobody buys or sells housing, because we've hit this huge housing crisis that was, by the way, as a country of our own making, we've lost revenue into the MTA, which then creates an MTA crisis. Both of those reality then get sent up to Albany as both less revenue coming to Albany in taxes and more pressure on Albany to do a bailout for the MTA. So I agree with the professor that the future for us at the state level and the city level is both smarter planning, better and fairer tax policy, and hopefully a president and a Congress who actually grasp the importance of urban America to the future of this country, and who actually believe in fair taxation and better use of government dollars from the federal level down to the local. But I do have a different perspective now that I go up to Albany every week or so, and I always joke I drive 3 hours north and 25 years back in history on many levels when I go up to Albany. But the fact is, we know, and you're all students and you're interested in policy, so you can go do the homework and discover that New York City sends between 13 and 15 billion more to Albany every year than we get back in services. And we send, I think, over 80 billion, the state of New York, down to Washington more than we get back, approximate numbers. And so we are what's called a donor state to Washington and a donor city to Albany. But when I hear someone say, well, then Albany should give us more back, I can say, yes, you're right, but I can also tell you it's not happening. And it's not happening soon. Our governor has basically done an analysis saying we're $47 billion short for the state budget over the next 4 years. And so the challenge I face as a legislator who wants to deliver for my city and my district, you're here in my district, by the way, but I also recognize that we have a huge deficit hole to fill in Albany. So the likelihood we're delivering for New York City is not that realistic in the next couple of years. The question for me, or my assignment, is I believe to do the least harm possible as we both make cuts in our state budget and as we make tough decisions about how we're going to increase our revenue. So I basically try to stick with these principles for myself. One, particularly in bad economic times, the last thing you should do is balance your budget on the backs of the poorest New Yorkers. They need our help more during bad economic times than any other time. We need to invest in food stamps and unemployment benefits and other just pure solid dollars to poor people who do nothing but spend it in their local economy immediately to meet their basic needs. So the state should do that, the federal government should do that.